In this presentation, I'm going to go over developing a research question. There'll be two parts to this presentation. So our objectives for these two presentations are to discuss what are and how to write a research question, purpose statements, hypothesis, and we're going to just discuss research and null hypotheses in this class, really more than the null. We'll get into that as we go. Identify the different variables, the dependent and independent variables. What are our what is a population? What's a target population? Samples. What are operational definitions? What are assumptions, limitations, and delimitations? And how to develop a title. Let's start off again with reminding ourselves the process of research. As this is in our book, we are interested in something. It has something to do with our clinical experience, our literature review, clinical theory has something to do in that area. We state a research problem, define our research question, which is the process we are in now, or discussing, evaluate the problem, identify our target population, which we're going to talk about, state the rationale, identify our variables, make our operational definition, and clarify our objectives, and state our hypothesis, and all those fun things. So all these things, that's what we're talking about this time, and during this whole process we're doing our review of literature. So we are in step one of our research process. We're going to be working through all the things in step one during this week of our class, and specifically in this lecture. So some criteria for any research question or purpose statement, as our textbook talks about, it has to answer the so what question. Does it even matter? Does anybody even care? Maybe you have something that you're interested in, but does anybody really care about the outcome of the study? Unfortunately, I found myself asking some of these research questions and actually doing some research, and the so what question wasn't very interesting when we boiled it down. So that's one thing you have to think about when you're developing a research question or a purpose statement. Is the question even answerable? Maybe you have a question, but there's no way to even go about answering it using any kind of research method that has been discovered at this point. So that's one thing, working with other people that have done research. Can you even answer the research question the way that you're asking that question? You may have to rephrase it in a different way. Can you do the study? Is it feasible? Do you have the resources, financial resources? At your clinic, do you have the equipment to do the research that you would be interested in doing? Well, sometimes you can't. You just don't have the ability to answer it. But if the question it has something that people actually care about, so yes, people do care about, the question is answerable, and you have the resources to do the study, then we go forward with the research. So next we want to talk about qualities of a research question or of a purpose statement. Both of these, the research question and the purpose statement, provide the focus or the direction for the study. I like to call it the bones of the study. We always want to go back to what's our research question or purpose statement when we're designing our study, when we're doing our literature review, when we're analyzing the data, everything that we do. It gives us our direction for what we're trying to do with all the different steps of our research. Typically, research questions or purpose statements suggest an association between two variables or a difference between variables. So those two terms are very important. Association means that as x goes up, the variable x goes up, variable y goes up or down, or there's no change. That's called a relationship between variables. That's called correlational research. We'll talk about that later in our class. The other side of this is their difference between the variables. So this is done in a lot of experimental designs or our random control trials, or when we talk about experimental design, I'm talking about all sorts of different types of experimental designs. So that is the typical study we have. We're trying to manipulate the variable, and then we do a study, then we see if there's a change in the end. So we want to see if there's a difference. If we have 3 groups in our study, Group A did one type of study, Group B did another kind of study, and Group C was our control group where they didn't do anything. And we have a group of subjects in each one of those 3 areas. Was there a change or a difference between the 3 groups that did that study? That's what we try to do when we're writing our research question and purpose statement. Our research question and purpose statement should include independent and dependent variables and target populations. In the second part of this presentation, I give you an example of research questions, purpose statements, and example hypotheses. Hypothesis is simply an educated guess on what you think is going to happen and predicts the outcome of the study. Based on your literature review, you read all the previous research, you guess this is what's going to happen. You can make that guess before you even do the study. This is primarily used in experimental and exploratory studies versus the other types of the designs. We're going to talk specifically about the research and the null hypotheses. And again, I'll give you an example of what those look like. And these are typically not found in journal articles, whereas the purpose statement is typically always found in a research article, where research questions may or may not be in the article. But generally speaking, a hypothesis is not. Variables are a topic that a lot of students have a difficult time understanding the difference between the independent and dependent variables. So hopefully I'm going to try to do my best to provide clarity here. So a variable is simply something or characteristic or attribute that can take any value or meaning. You all probably taken math at one point or another. The old variable x, find x, that's a variable. This variable can be measured or can be observed. That means we can see it. And there are several different types of variables. We have the dependent variable, DV, is the outcome variable or the outcome measures. We'll use that terminology a lot in athletic training journals or any other medical type journals. And the independent variable, we have several different types of independent variables. We have categorical variables, extraneous or confounding variables, and control variables. And I'm going to explain each one of these in more detail. So first are dependent variables. This is something that's measured. That's the first thing you have to remember is the dependent variable is always measured some way. It's the outcome of the study. It's what we're trying to figure out. It's dependent on the independent variable. So examples of the dependent variable: prom scores, injury rates, survey scores. Again, it's something that's measured. Again, I'm going to give more examples of this as we continue on, and especially in part 2 of the lecture. There's a lot more about independent variables than there are dependent variables. So the independent variable is manipulated or changed. It's controlled by the researcher. Again, anything that you as the researcher can control or change, we can have many levels or types. That means that, like the example I used earlier, if we have 3 groups of our research, 3 groups that we're doing in a research project, each one of those three groups are manipulating the independent variable. Again, I'm going to give you an example in the part 2 of this lecture. So more examples of this could be a weight training program intensity. So let's say you have group 1 with doing an exercise at 80% of their max, then another group doing it at 70% of their max, and group 3 doing nothing. So those are the independent variables, and that's different levels there I'm talking about. Teaching methods is another example. ACL prevention program, since there are multiple ACL prevention program, is an independent variable, something that can be manipulated by the researcher. Now, the categorical variables cannot be changed. So these are things like gender, race, and age. Extraneous or confounding variables. This is anything that the researcher really can't control, or it's unknown, that may influence the results from the study. Sometimes you get in the middle of a study and all of a sudden you realize, oh man, that I forgot it. I didn't think about that, and that's what it is. It's a variable that affects the outcome of your study. And a lot of times in journal articles, these are discussed, usually on the in the discussion section. They'll have a limitations section, different than the limitations I'm going to talk about, but it has something to do with that. It's usually, what I'm talking about limitations here is, it's usually when you're designing your study, you know this is a limitation. Then there's limitations after you finish the study. You go, oh, here's another limitation I didn't think about. Control variables. This is something that can influence the result of the study, and these are controlled by the researcher, meaning that we can delimit the study to a certain group. So we may control the variable, the independent variable, to a specific type of research, specific type of exercise, a specific type of rehab, ACL rehab or prevention program, or any other things that we control throughout the study. Our next topic is population and samples. I like this graphic here. So the population, their target population is everybody that could be in a study throughout our world. So that can be, let's say, you want to know, and we'll use ACL prevention program for athletes. So we can narrow that down to female college athletes. So that's our target population, female college athletes. And then we have our sampling procedure that we use, which we'll talk about it in, I'm not sure if it's next week or the week after, is how we go about actually getting our sample of who's actually going to be in the study. And then from our sampling frame, that's who we can actually have access to. We can pull out even a smaller sample from our sampling frame. Those are the actual people that are in our study. Again, there's a bunch of different ways to go about getting people to be in our study, the participants from our target population. That's the sampling procedure. And again, we'll talk about that as we go on in our class. Operational definitions is on the screen. So we have to define the terms that we use in our research. There's to make sure that everybody else who is reading our paper, reading our article, has an understanding of how we are defining terms. These operational terms have to be very clear So as on the screen here, it says an operational definition is a detailed specification of how one would go about measuring a given variable. Operational definitions can range from very simple and straightforward to quite complex, depending on the nature of the variable and the needs of the researcher. Operational definitions should be tied to the theoretical constructs under study. The theory behind the research often clarifies the nature of the variables involved. Again, as I said earlier, we need to provide a reader with definitions for any term. So some examples of kind of things that need to be defined is, what do we mean by pain? What do we mean by range of motion? What do we mean by injury or injury rates? What do we mean by return to play? All these things need to be clarified in somewhere. Usually it's going to be in our methods or in the introduction section. Assumptions are what do you think or assume about the participants or subjects in the study, the topic, the conditions, the equipment, the survey, anything. So some examples here of the assumptions is that all the participants tried their hardest, or that the prom measured what it was intended to measure. All the equipment was actually calibrated. So these are assumptions that you are making when you're doing a study. Limitations are the things that can have negative effects on the study, like I was talking about a little bit earlier. Some examples of this is the equipment was not calibrated, the instruments or the survey was not reliable or valid. So this can be the prom. You thought it actually measured one thing, but it was actually designed to measure something else. And your participants that you have in your study are not motivated to actually do anything. Our next area is called delimitations. These are the choices by the researcher concerning the variable and target population. So some examples here is that, say, your target population is male college students. That's pretty broad. What age are these students? Are they just freshmen from a certain college? Some other things that we can delimit are the types of proms or pain scales. Can be anything that the researcher controls. Again, that's the choices that you make as the researcher concerning the variables in the target population. Again, I'm going to give examples of all these in part 2. And finally, our titles. The title for our article. The title should be written after you develop the purpose statement and a research question. Usually titles are done towards the end of everything. And this is a quote from another research methods book. The titles convey the content, but this should be done as succinctly as possible. So you want to provide enough information that the readers have an idea what the study is about. And I think you should avoid including the research design in the title. I've heard that a good length for a title is anywhere from 12 to 16 words. I think that's a good ideal to have, is keep the title succinct and to the point. But you don't want it to have just 4 words. That may not be enough, so you have to try to base it on your purpose statement and the research question. Okay, so that's all the things that are important when we're doing step 1, which is about the research question and research problem. So the next part of this presentation, I'm going to give you an example of a research question, or a purpose statement, research question, all these other things. Then we'll identify all these things that we just went over.